There is a moment before every war that most people never notice. It does not appear on television. It is not announced in speeches. And it does not look dramatic. There are no explosions, no advancing armies, no visible signs of conflict. But in that quiet moment, the outcome has already begun to take shape. Because long before soldiers move, long before tanks roll forward, the question has already been asked: who controls the sky? And whoever answers that question first begins to control everything that follows. This is not a modern idea. It is not a theory developed in recent decades. It is a pattern that has repeated itself across history. At first slowly, then suddenly, and now almost completely. But to understand it properly, you have to remove one assumption: the assumption that war begins on the ground. Because it does not. It begins with visibility, the ability to see, to detect movement, to understand position, and to act before the opponent even realizes what is happening. This is what the sky provides. It provides perspective. And in warfare, perspective is power. Imagine two forces facing each other. One can see everything. The other sees almost nothing. One can strike from above. The other can only react. One can move freely. The other must move cautiously. Now ask yourself, is that a fair fight? Or is the outcome already decided? This is the essence of air superiority. Not dominance, not destruction, but freedom. The freedom to operate without interference. And the ability to deny that same freedom to the opponent. It sounds simple, but achieving it is one of the most complex challenges ever solved in military engineering. Because controlling the sky means controlling something that cannot be held. You cannot occupy it. You cannot fortify it in the traditional sense. You cannot draw a line and say, "This is mine." Instead, you must constantly maintain control. Through presence, through technology, through awareness, through speed, and through precision. And this is where things begin to change. Because as technology evolved, the sky stopped being empty. It became a domain filled with sensors, signals, invisible networks, and machines moving faster than human perception. What was once just open space became a battlefield. And once that happened, everything else followed. Wars became faster, more precise, more asymmetric, and in many cases, more predictable. Because when one side achieves air superiority, the rest of the conflict begins to collapse inward. Not immediately, not visibly, but structurally. Supply lines weaken, communication breaks, morale shifts, decision-making slows down, and slowly, the ability to resist begins to disappear. This is why, in modern military planning, air superiority is not a goal. It is a requirement. Without it, every operation becomes harder. Every movement becomes riskier. Every decision carries more uncertainty. And most importantly, time begins to work against you. Because when you do not control the sky, you are always reacting, always adjusting, always exposed. And in war, the side that reacts eventually loses. Now consider the opposite. A force that controls the air. Not perfectly, not absolutely, but sufficiently. Enough to operate freely. Enough to deny the opponent the same freedom. That force gains something extremely valuable. Time, the ability to choose when and where to act. The ability to concentrate power. The ability to disrupt without being disrupted. And once you have time, you can shape the battlefield. You can isolate targets. You can weaken resistance. You can create conditions where victory becomes inevitable. This is why, in many modern conflicts, the most important phase of the war happens before most people even realize it has begun. It happens in the suppression of air defenses, in the destruction of radar systems, in the disruption of communication networks, in the silent dismantling of the opponent's ability to see. Because once that is gone, everything else follows. But here is where it becomes more interesting. Air superiority is not just about aircraft. It is not just about speed, or altitude, or maneuverability. Those things matter, but they are only part of the system. The real system is much larger. It includes sensors that detect signals across vast distances. It includes electronic warfare systems that confuse and disrupt. It includes missiles that travel faster than sound. It includes satellites that observe from orbit. It includes algorithms that process information in real time. And it includes decision-making structures that can act faster than the opponent. All of these elements come together to create a condition where one side can operate and the other cannot. And that condition is what decides everything. But there is also a misconception, the idea that air superiority is absolute. That once achieved, it cannot be challenged. That is not true. In fact, air superiority is always temporary, always contested, always dependent on maintaining an advantage. Because the moment you stop adapting, the moment you stop evolving, the balance begins to shift. And history has shown this repeatedly. Technologies that once guaranteed dominance eventually become vulnerable. Tactics that once worked perfectly begin to fail, and systems that once seemed invincible are eventually overcome. This is why air superiority is not a static achievement. It is a continuous process, a constant effort to stay ahead, to innovate, to adapt, to anticipate, and to act before the opponent can respond. And this brings us to a deeper realization. Air superiority is not just a military concept. It is an engineering problem. A problem of detection, of communication, of control, of integration, and of timing. It requires understanding not just how machines operate, but how systems interact, how information flows, how decisions are made, and how advantages are created and sustained. Because in the end, war is not just about force. It is about systems. And the system that controls the sky controls the system of war itself. Now, as we move forward, we will begin to explore how this system was built, how it evolved, how it was tested in real conflicts, and how it continues to change. Because what you are about to see is not just a story about aircraft. It is a story about control. And once you understand it, you will never look at war the same way again. There was a time when the sky meant nothing in war. Armies marched, navies sailed, and battles were decided where men could stand. The sky was empty, untouched, irrelevant, and then humans left the ground. At first, it did not look important. In the early years of the First World War, aircraft were fragile, slow, unarmed. Pilots were not even considered combat units. They were observers. Their job was simple: fly above the battlefield, look down, report what they see. But that small change changed everything. Because for the first time in history, one side could see beyond the horizon. They could track movement. They could detect formations. They could anticipate actions. And suddenly, war was no longer blind. This was the first shift. Not power, not destruction, but awareness. And once awareness entered the battlefield, it could not be removed. But awareness alone is not enough. Because if you can see the enemy can see you. And that leads to the next step: denial. If observation gives advantage, then denying observation becomes critical. And that is how air combat truly began. Not as a race for speed, not as a display of skill, but as a struggle to control information. Pilots started carrying weapons. At first simple. Rifles, handguns, then machine guns. Aircraft began to chase each other. Not to destroy armies, but to remove eyes from the sky. And that is the moment air superiority was born. Not as a doctrine, not as a strategy, but as a necessity. If you control the sky, you control who sees. And if you control who sees, you control what happens next. Now move forward. The Second World War. This is where everything accelerates. Aircraft are no longer fragile. They are faster, stronger, purpose-built, and most importantly, they are integrated into strategy. Air power is no longer a support element. It becomes a central component of war. Bombers begin to strike deep into enemy territory. Factories, rail networks, fuel depots, entire cities. The idea is simple. Do not just fight the army. Disrupt the system that supports it. And suddenly, war is no longer limited to the battlefield. It becomes industrial, systemic, total, but alongside bombing, another evolution takes place. Fighter aircraft, not just to attack, but to protect, to escort bombers, to defend airspace, to challenge enemy control. And now, the sky is no longer empty. It is contested, continuously, relentlessly, and here we begin to see something important. Air superiority is not achieved by one aircraft. It is achieved by interaction between bombers, fighters, radar, ground control, logistics, production capacity, training. All of these elements combine, and the side that integrates them better begins to dominate. But even then, there is a limitation. Speed, range, altitude, all constrained by technology. And then, another shift happens. The jet engine. This is not just an improvement. It is a transformation. Aircraft are no longer bound by propellers. They break previous limits. They move faster, climb higher, engage differently. And suddenly, time compresses. Engagement windows shrink. Decisions must be made faster. And human reaction begins to reach its limits. This is the beginning of modern air combat, where speed alone is not enough, where awareness must keep up, where systems must process information faster than humans can think, and where mistakes become unforgiving. Because at high speed, there is no second chance. Now something subtle begins to emerge. A realization that winning in the air is not about having the fastest aircraft or the most powerful weapon. It is about understanding the system. Who detects first? Who decides first? Who acts first? This becomes the new hierarchy. Detection, decision, action, and the side that completes this cycle faster begins to dominate the sky. This is the foundation. The early wars did not perfect air superiority, but they revealed its structure. They showed that control of the sky is not a single event. It is a process built on awareness, denial, integration, speed, and decision-making. And once this structure was understood, the next phase became inevitable. Engineering it deliberately, not just using aircraft, but designing entire systems to control the sky. And that is where we go next. By the time the jet age matured, something had changed. Air superiority was no longer accidental. It was engineered, deliberately, systematically, and with increasing precision. Because militaries began to understand a critical truth. You do not win the sky by flying better. You win the sky by seeing better. In acting faster. This is where technology begins to dominate. Radar. At first it seems simple. A signal sent out. A reflection received. But what it actually does is extend perception beyond human limits. beyond visual range, beyond intuition. Now you are not just reacting to what you see. You are reacting to what your system detects. And that changes everything. Because detection creates advantage. But it also creates vulnerability. If radar can detect, it can also be targeted, disrupted, destroyed, and so begins another layer. Electronic warfare, the ability to interfere with signals, to create noise, to confuse, to hide, to appear where you are not, and disappear where you are. Now the battle is no longer just physical. It becomes invisible, a conflict of signals, of frequencies, of information, and in this invisible layer, outcomes are often decided before weapons are even used. But even that is not enough, because detection without action is useless. So the next step is integration, linking systems together, aircraft, ground stations, satellites, missile systems, all connected, all sharing information, all reacting in coordination. Now the battlefield becomes a network, and the side with the better network begins to control the flow of the war. But here is where the complexity increases. Because more systems mean more data, more signals, more decisions, and human operators begin to reach their limits. So automation enters, not fully autonomous, but assisted, guided, enhanced, systems that help prioritize targets, track movement, predict behavior, and reduce the time between detection and action. Because that time is everything. If you can detect first and act before the opponent responds, you gain control, even if only for a moment. And in modern warfare, a moment is enough. Now consider the aircraft itself. It is no longer just a machine that flies. It is a node in a system, carrying sensors, processing data, communicating constantly, making decisions in coordination with other systems. And this is where stealth appears, not as invisibility, but as reduction, reducing detectability, reducing signal return, reducing the chance of being targeted. Because if the enemy cannot detect you, they cannot act against you. And if they cannot act, you gain freedom. Freedom to operate, freedom to strike, freedom to control. But stealth alone is not enough. Because once detected, it loses its advantage. So it must be combined with speed, with electronic warfare, with tactics, with network integration, all working together. And this is the key realization. Air superiority is not a product. It is not an aircraft. It is not a weapon. It is a system designed to dominate the cycle of war. Detection, decision, action. Whoever controls that cycle controls the sky, and whoever controls the sky controls everything that follows. But there is also a challenge. As systems become more advanced, they also become more fragile, more dependent, more complex, and more vulnerable to disruption. Because if you break the network, you break the system. If you disrupt communication, you slow decision-making. If you degrade sensors, you reduce awareness. And suddenly, even the most advanced force becomes uncertain. And uncertainty in war is dangerous. This is why modern conflicts are different. Not just battles of power, but battles of systems, where both sides try to degrade each other's ability to see, to decide, to act, and when neither side fully succeeds, the sky becomes contested, unstable, dangerous, and that brings us to the present, where air superiority is no longer guaranteed, where even advanced forces struggle to achieve full control, where defenses are layered, distributed, adaptive, and where the cost of failure is high. Because without control of the sky, everything slows down, everything becomes harder, everything becomes uncertain. And that is where the next phase begins. Real wars, real examples, where these systems were tested, where air superiority was achieved, and where it failed. And in those moments, we begin to see its true impact. By 1991, air superiority was no longer an idea. It was a weapon, and in the Gulf War, it was used with a level of precision the world had never seen before. At the time, Iraq had one of the largest militaries in the world. Thousands of tanks, extensive air defenses, a significant air force. On paper, it looked strong, but strength on paper does not matter if your system cannot see. Because the war did not begin with tanks. It began with the sky. The first targets were not soldiers. They were systems, radar installations, communication networks, air defense nodes, runways, command centers, and all of this happened before any major ground movement. Night after night, aircraft entered Iraqi airspace. Not randomly, not aggressively, but systematically. Each mission designed to remove one layer of awareness. Each strike reducing the ability to detect. Each disruption slowing the ability to respond. And slowly, something invisible began to collapse. The Iraqi system. Pilots could not coordinate. Radar could not track reliably. Commands could not be transmitted effectively. And when the system breaks, the individual units become isolated. And isolated units are easy to defeat. Within days, the sky was no longer contested. It was controlled, not perfectly, but sufficiently, enough that coalition aircraft could operate with freedom. And that freedom changed everything, because once aircraft can operate freely, they can strike anywhere. Supply lines, armored columns, logistics hubs, and even morale itself, because constant exposure creates psychological pressure. When you cannot move without being seen, when you cannot regroup without being targeted, when you cannot respond effectively, you begin to lose before the battle even begins. And that is exactly what happened. By the time the ground invasion started, the outcome was already shaped. Resistance existed, but it was fragmented, disorganized, unable to coordinate effectively. And the reason was simple. The sky had already been taken. This is the clearest demonstration of a principle. Air superiority does not destroy the enemy directly. It removes their ability to function. And once that ability is gone, defeat becomes inevitable. 12 years later, the same battlefield, but a different approach. If the Gulf War demonstrated control, the Iraq War of 2003 demonstrated speed. The strategy was simple. Overwhelm the system before it can react. Not gradually, not over weeks, but almost instantly. This is what became known as shock and awe. Massive precision strikes, focused not on destroying everything, but on paralyzing decision-making. Leadership targets, communication hubs, control centers, all struck rapidly, all within a compressed time frame. The goal was not just physical damage. It was psychological disruption. If leadership cannot communicate, if decisions cannot be made, if orders cannot be transmitted, then the system freezes. And when a system freezes in war, it collapses. But there is something deeper here. This level of coordination was not possible in earlier wars. It required integration, real-time intelligence, satellite support, precision guidance, networked systems, everything working together. And when it worked, the effect was overwhelming. Resistance still existed, but it lacked direction, lacked coordination, lacked coherence, and without those elements, it could not scale. This is the next evolution. Air superiority not just as control, but as acceleration, winning faster, before the opponent can adapt, before they can reorganize, before they can respond. And that speed is often more decisive than raw power. Now move to the present. A war where something is missing. Not power, not weapons, but control. In Ukraine, neither side fully controls the sky. Air defenses remain active, layered, distributed, adaptive. Aircraft cannot operate freely. Every mission carries risk. Every movement is contested. And because of that, everything slows down. Advances become difficult. Concentration of forces becomes dangerous. Logistics become exposed. And the battlefield becomes static. This is what happens when air superiority is denied. Not lost completely, but prevented, contested continuously. And the result is a war of attrition. Long, costly, uncertain, because without control of the sky, you cannot shape the battlefield. You can only react to it. And reacting is always slower than controlling. This is one of the most important modern lessons. Air superiority is no longer easy to achieve. Because defenses have evolved. Missile systems, mobile launchers, decentralized networks, electronic warfare, all designed to deny control. Not to win the sky completely, but to prevent the opponent from owning it. And that is enough. Because if no one controls the sky, no one can dominate the ground. And the war continues. Unresolved. Now step back. Look at the pattern. Different wars, different technologies, different strategies, but the same structure. When one side controls the sky, the war moves quickly, decisively, predictably. When no one controls the sky, the war slows down, becomes uncertain, becomes prolonged. This is not coincidence. It is structure. Air superiority is not just an advantage. It is a condition that determines how the rest of the war unfolds. But here is the deeper realization. Control of the sky is becoming harder, not easier, because every advantage creates a counter. Stealth leads to better detection. Detection leads to better disruption. Disruption leads to more resilient systems. And the cycle continues. This is an arms race, not just of weapons, but of systems, of information, of timing, and of integration. Because in the end, the side that wins is not the one with the most power, but the one with the most coherent system. The system that can detect faster, decide faster, act faster, and adapt faster. And that is where the future is heading. Towards automation, towards artificial intelligence, towards systems that operate at speeds beyond human reaction, where decisions are assisted, where coordination is instant, where the cycle becomes even faster. And in that future, the importance of air superiority does not decrease. It increases, because as everything accelerates, control becomes more valuable. And without control, there is only chaos. Now return to the beginning. War does not begin on the ground. It begins with control. Control of perception, control of information, control of timing, and most importantly, control of the sky. Because whoever controls the sky does not just influence the battle, they define it. And once you understand that, you begin to see war differently. Not as a clash of forces, but as a competition of systems. And in that competition, the sky is where everything is decided first.